Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Success in Black and White.
The podcast. We are back one more again. We are back one more again
Coming to you live.
from the house.
That's right, the house.
And again, we are not alone right now. And we're so glad.
I know.
And I'm looking forward to this one. And I'm going to hand it over to you and let you do your thing with the intro so that we can dive right in.
Okay. Well, I am super excited. You guys already got to hear all about Dr. Chantel BUGGS. I am really excited because just from a personal standpoint, aside from everything else you got to hear in her biography, this is a person that I have taken to quietly stalking on Twitter because she says whatever she feels like saying, and I love it and I'm here for it. And in addition, she has done so much. You guys got to hear some of the research and some of the stuff that she's involved in, but she's done a lot of research that for us personally has really spoken to us, being that we are an interracial couple, that we are raising multiracial children, and that, you know, we have that family dynamic. We were excited that we were able to get you, Dr. BUGGS, to come on our podcast and talk to people who are maybe in similar families as us, or maybe part of our families and friends. Just about some of your research and about you and some of the questions that we sent to you to help answer for our audience. So we're excited to have you. And really, we got a chance to kind of introduce you a little bit, but we want our audience to hear about you from you. So tell us a little bit about you and your background and what is it you're passionate about? Why are you studying interracial couples and why are you studying multiracial children and families? Like, we want to know all about you in a nutshell.
As I come in laughing like a maniac. Thank you for all of that enthusiasm. It continues to kind of surprise me that anybody sees any value in anything that I have to say. I apologize now if my puppy decides she's going to make an appearance here. She's climbing on me right now, so she might just start, I don't know, speaking into the mic. So I am the oldest of four. My parents met in the Marine Corps. So I am a military brat. I am obviously the child of an interracial couple. My dad is from Flint, Michigan. And my mom is, I guess I would say she's from kind of rural, mountainous Colorado. She kind of moved around to a couple of different places, but like my grandma is from Silverton, Colorado, which is a small mining town up in the mountains. And then my mom, I think, spent a good portion of her childhood growing up in a small town called Meeker. She likes to talk about how she had only seen a Black person on television for like pretty much her entire, she didn't see a Black person in real life until she was like 19 and she had moved to South Carolina. So yeah, there's a lot of aspects of my mom's kind of background and biography that kind of make it hilarious that she married a Black man and like an unambiguously Black man, and, you know, has four very brown-skinned children, you know, and had to deal a lot with, you know, people assuming that she had adopted us. They were like, oh, how wonderful for you to adopt those four little brown children, you know? So there's definitely those aspects. And then, you know, and then also just kind of the ways that people responded to her and my father. My dad, one of the most, it's a compelling story for a lot of reasons to me, just based on what I researched. My dad talks about one of the first times she brought him back to Meeker. I think they were back, I don't know, for some reunion thing, something. And, you know, so my dad was a wrestler for the Marine Corps. He wrestled for the Marine Corps. So he was very fit. He actually went to the Olympic trials. He was a very talented wrestler. So, you know, my dad's like 6'1", again, unambiguously Black man with muscles. So when he shows up into this, small little white town that has no Black people ever, they all assumed that my dad was an NFL player. And then my dad played for the Broncos, and my mom was just, like, good for her, that she, got her an NFL player. Because of course, like that, right, a pro athlete would make a Black person acceptable. And my dad was talking about how these like other women like at this bar or whatever they were at like were trying to hit on him, and he was just like, I need to get out of here before someone like tries to string me up because the wrong woman talked to me. And so we've definitely had like conversations, me and my dad, as I've gotten older, and the research that I specialize in, kind of just talking about how a lot of the ways that my mom, I think, was like oblivious to some of the things that were happening, in, kind of how people responded to them, which I think certainly kind of manifests in some of the dynamic that I have with my white family members, especially as I have gone further in my studies, come to the specialization that I have in studying race and racism. And have just developed a particular set of politics. It's definitely created a lot of tension between me and my white family members, to the point that there's always a lot of these kind of secret phone calls that are, what is Chantel posting on the internet? What is Chantel posting on Facebook? Why does Chantel, hate white people? She's so racist against white people. My dad's response is always, well, this is what she studies. She's literally an expert in this. And that's not typically my mom's response. I don't want to necessarily, go too deep into the tragic mulatto waters, I guess. But yeah, no, there's definitely the kind of experiences just that I had being a mixed kid in a military town, because my parents, we moved to Colorado Springs when I was like 7. So after I spent a year on the north side of town going to a majority white school. And then we moved to the south side of town where I went to a majority Black and Hispanic school. But because it's an Army town and we lived like 15 minutes from Fort Carson, a lot of my friends were mixed race. There's probably, I don't have like, the data offhand, I think, to like rattle off about this, but I would imagine you probably have a really disproportionate percentage of military families that are interracial. And a lot of that has to do with the military being one of the oldest integrated institutions. But it's also kind of the most widely and consistently integrated institutions that we have. We can certainly talk about, kind of all the problematics and issues that I have now that, I have learned things about war and colonialism and all those things. It's definitely a weird kind of position to be like anti-military and be also a military brat of 2 very proud Marines. But yeah, so, growing up in a military town, I had a ton of friends who were multiracial. So I didn't necessarily feel like I was some weird person, because so many of my friends were also mixed race. Like that was just so normal. I felt way more out of place, when I went to college, and not necessarily even, I wouldn't even necessarily say as a multiracial person necessarily. It was definitely more the combination of the impact of class, I would argue. Because I went to Duke for undergrad. And so a lot of the student body there, regardless of, kind of racial background, are, come from pretty educated families, come from at least more affluent families than I came from. My family, I feel, is very strongly working class. It's a weird situation, obviously, I think, because some people would argue that military isn't necessarily working class, because, some of the kinds of classed benefits that can come with military service. But, we never owned a home when I, with my parents. Like my dad didn't own a home until like he and my mother had broken up. And so him and my stepmom had owned a home because she got it out of her first divorce. And my stepmother is also white. She's Canadian. So like, my dad kind of just, kind of got brought into a home that she already owned. And, and then every subsequent home, obviously, after that they've owned together. Whereas my mom didn't buy a house until just, I think, honestly, she bought it probably just as I was getting ready to finish, I think, my PhD. And she was able to use a VA loan to do that. But, so like my entire childhood, we rented. We lived in, a neighborhood with a bunch of other working class folks. There was a trailer park, across the street from where I grew up. So for me, I feel like I have a very much like a working class mentality, even though, some other people might not necessarily see it that way. So that definitely was like jarring to go to a place like Duke and all of these people, like not only do their parents have college degrees, but they have graduate degrees, and their parents went to Duke or went to these other, affluent institutions, and like all of their siblings have gone to college. I'm like, it's just like, and these are Black people like that, right? And I'm just like, I've never met Black people like this really, like there were a couple, I guess, of my friends maybe who had parents who had, maybe a bachelor's. Often I think because they also were like in the military. So, they were able to use that money to pay to go to school. I think my parents had one friend who had like done graduate school, but it was just, I wasn't used to like super professional Black people, kind of in my milieu. And so then like going to college with all these people where it was totally, run of the mill that, they went to Duke because everybody at their high school, was going to these, high ranking colleges, whereas it was a huge deal that I got into Duke. And people were shocked years later that I actually stayed and stuck it out and graduated. They were like, oh, wow, you're still there. They're like, oh, wow, you graduated. Good for you. I think the statistics of my high school when I graduated, it was like 15% of the student body was expected to go on to college.
Wow.
So like those are, so that I think kind of like that first generation, that working class identity, this kind of kid of a military background identity, like those are all things I think that really shaped kind of how I approach everything in my career now. Especially I think when it comes to teaching and kind of how I try to like the things that I want to prioritize in terms of how I treat students and how I approach things in the classroom. But, obviously with that background, there's also kind of the evolution that I've had as a researcher and as an educator. So, being exposed to Black feminist theory, to post-colonial theory, to critical race theory, which there's been some interesting discussions among academics right now, actually, thanks to, as I like to call him, Agent Orange, and his, new policy, his new policy about how you aren't allowed to teach white privilege or critical race theory workshops in the government anymore. So as I've read, all of this kind of work, it's definitely shifted my politics a bit. So I'm definitely a lot more, I think, politically left than virtually all of my family. Mm-hmm. There's definitely some Trumpers on my mother's side of the family. So it, and but even my siblings, I don't know how my siblings voted. And I know my mom is a pretty staunch Democrat, but we definitely still have we have a family group chat. So my parents have been divorced since I was in 4th grade, but we're all in a group chat together. It's this is a fairly recent development. A lot of the dynamics, I think, between my parents and all of us kind of shifted after my dad got diagnosed with kidney failure. So my dad had been dialysis. So my dad's coming up, I think, on year 2 or 3 of his kidney transplant. And he's doing really well, but, he was on dialysis for a long time. And so, I think once you have, families kind of dealing with, critical illnesses, people will, kind of put grudges or feelings to the side. But I say that to say that, like, there was definitely messages from my mom, I think, that she maybe didn't intend to be racialized. Whatever, I'm just going to say it. She gets mad at me about the things I say about our family anyway. So I feel like there was definitely kind of a clear messaging that there was a tension around any interest in Black men as like kind of romantic partners. And I think a lot of that was tied to the way that my parents' marriage dissolved very dramatically. And, there was, infidelities and all of those other kinds of things. So, I mean, it definitely, I think, has informed, I think, how my mom responds to me and my siblings' racial identities and how we believe we move through the world and who we find ourselves romantically involved with. So there's definitely, then I get a lot of this, you do know you have a white mother. Why are you being so pro-Black? And I'm worried you're going to turn into an angry Black woman and all these other kinds of things. And it's not just my mom, right? Who kind of like utilizes that rhetoric. Like, when my sister was here earlier in the year, we got into a big argument because she was just like saying basically a lot of like my mom's talking points, but coming from her. So there's like this tension that in choosing Blackness, I'm choosing my father who treated my mother in a particular way. And so then, right, it's not just a rejecting of whiteness or a rejecting of my mother. It's also like, in her mind, I think, supporting treating her in a particular way. So it's like all of that is tied up together in this really complex way.
I feel like
wow, I just gave y'all so much information.
We love it. I love it. I was going to say that, to me, that's a really good shift, even into the next question that we as a white woman married to a Black man, and we have children who identify as Black children, and they also identify as white children. They are multiracial. Like, our question for you as we approach an age with our kids, and I think that some of our audience, the ones that we're well aware of, have probably younger kids as well that are around our kids' age, like 5 and under, as we start to think about how do we talk to them about some of the things happening in the world and their identities. Like, what are the most important pieces of their identities that we should uphold for them in order to make sure that they are accepting of all of their identities and to give them confidence in who they are?
Yeah. I mean, so when I was growing up, I mean, my mom very much was on that, you're both, like that was very much her refrain. And my father's rebuttal would often be, well, the world is going to see you as Black. The world is going to treat you as Black. You need to be like, he was very much like, they need to be prepared to be treated as Black people, assumed to be Black people, to deal with the discrimination that Black people experience. So that was always, I think, a running tension. And I also think too, I guess there were probably multiple reasons, but I think about how we ended up in Colorado Springs because my mom had grown up in Colorado rather than, like, say, ending up in Detroit and living near my father's family in Flint. So we did not go visit my father's side of the family. I believe the last time before I was just in Detroit and Flint last year for my great aunt's 75th birthday. Where there were probably almost 100 different family members that came to that. The last time I had been there, I was 3 years old. So I didn't really have close relationships to my Black extended family. And I think some of that certainly had to do with the fact that like we lived in Colorado, where we could drive, you know, a couple of hours to where my grandmother lived at the time. So, you know, like I saw my white extended family in a way I did not spend time with my Black extended family. And so I kind of like latched on to my childhood friends, you know, who were either multiracial Black like me or were, you know, not maybe didn't identify as multiracial, but, you know, so I kind of latched onto their families for that connection to kind of Black cultural practice. And I mean, one of my mom's really close friends is Black, and, you know, her mother would babysit us in the summers, you know, so I was around all of, you know, her grandkids. And so we basically, you know, these were my play cousins, right? You know, so fictive kin for the win. And so it's, I feel like there were ways, maybe intentionally or not, that I think that my mom, especially when, you know, she became our sole, you know, kind of custodial parent after my parents' divorce, that, you know, she kind of tried to support our Blackness. You know, so we continued living on the South Side. I continued going to school you know, with majority people of color. There was a point, I think, where my mom wanted me to try to go to this private school. She wanted me to kind of try to test in to go there. And I was very resistant because she wanted me to go for high school. You know, this is one of those smaller K through 12. So they had no sports. If I would have gotten in and enrolled there, the other 2 Black students enrolled at that school were like in the elementary school ages. So I'm like, I literally would have been the only Black person. I'm like, you want me to go from a school where there are a ton of Black and Hispanic and dark-skinned Asian and indigenous people, and there's white people, right? Like there's all of these people in these, you want me to go from that to a majority white school in the affluent part of town just so I can, you know, get the opportunities with that. And then I was also mad because I'm like, there's no sports. You know, I'm like, no, like I've given up, you know, I've had to babysit my siblings for all of these years, you know, since my parents, you know, since like the age of 10, you know, so high school was finally going to be that time where I actually could do those after school curriculars, because I didn't have to go home to take care of my siblings. And so I remember my mom being like all bothered that I was so resistant. And not just that it was just about like the sports thing and leaving my friends, but for me, it was a Blackness thing too. I'm like, no, I don't want to be the only Black person that's in the high school. Like, no, I don't want to be that. So, you know, I mean, it's funny because I think like my mom, for some reason, seems to like reflect back and seems to see me as like less identifying with my Blackness when I was younger. But then I think about like some of the things I was involved in, especially as like a middle school and a high schooler. So, you know, like I was involved with the National Urban League, and actually like, you know, won a scholarship from them when I went to college. I was part of this nonprofit that one of my friends who's Black, her parents were both teachers, and they also had a nonprofit. And so like they had like a step team, and our step team was called Bout It. So like, you know, I was a part of that for years. I did this program called the Black Issues Forum at Colorado State. You know, I was in, you know, the Black Student Union at my high school, and, you know, so I did a lot of organizing through that. So like I reflect back now, and like as much as I think I definitely still held on to some of that, you know, like multiracial exceptionalism. Like there's this awful poem that I wrote for some competition when I was like, I think middle school age. So I was probably 12 or something. And I can provide you the poem later. The only reason that like the font, the text of this is somewhere is because my mother, she must have kept it somewhere. And she literally like posted it on Facebook. And so all of these friends of mine from college are like, oh yes, Miss Faye, we love it. But anyway, so like the gist of this poem is basically I'm like, oh, I'm bringing together all of the different, I very much, I think, had like been brainwashed into thinking that I had some kind of magical, bridging mixed race powers. And, I was bringing these different groups into one person. So that was definitely, the mixed race, savior Kool-Aid. I was drinking that at one point. But I think I cared a lot about being Black and things that mattered to Black people. And I was surrounded by Black people who, I loved and cared for, even as I felt, kind of left out in that I didn't have the connections to my Black biological, extended family. I had all of these other people in my life who were Black. So yeah, I feel like now I can look back and I'm like, actually, like, I feel like I was, exhibiting like a lot of these kind of Black politics, even as a teenager, that I think maybe my mom just didn't, I don't know what she maybe thought I was doing with those things. But like, I remember one of the years I was on the Black Student Union exec board. So my high school, we did like these pep rallies for like different things. And so we would have a Black History Month pep rally. And so the Black Student Union basically came up with the programming for that. And so for whatever reason, I forget exactly what my position was, but I was the one basically who organized the Black History Month pep rally one year. And I was either a junior or maybe a senior that year. And is that my email dinging? Like, what is that sound? It's driving me up the wall. I'm just gonna exit out of that window. Okay, sorry. Yeah, no. So like, I remember, so I wanted it to be about like, the theme of it to be about Black art. And so like, I put together like this big slideshow about like all of these like Black artists, like Romare Bearden and Basquiat and all these people. And then had some, like, we had some of our musicians playing music. And then there was another, like, one of these girls in my graduating class performed a poem, and she kind of, dressed, all Black with the beret. And, it was supposed to be kind of, like this empowerment themed poem. And so like, a number of the Black students in my graduating class, were like, yelling out Black power and all those other kinds of things, like, it's like affirmations. And a group of white students got pissed and went to our principal, who was Black, and our principal was Black in an interracial relationship with an Asian woman. Went to him, and they said that they felt intimidated by all of our Black classmates yelling out Black power during this assembly, and how if they had yelled out white power, that wouldn't be allowed. And why is there a Black student union? Why can't we have a white student union? And why isn't there a white history? All of that stuff. And this is happening, as a high schooler, in 2004, 2005. And so my principal's response actually was to ban all interest groups after that. So like, there was obviously the Black Student Union, there was an Asian Pacific Islander student union, because we had like a huge population of Samoans at my high school. Like, all of that was banned, and he was like, you can have just like a diversity group, and that's it. And so, I mean, that happened, I think, after, like, the ban went into effect after I graduated. But I'm just like, I think about that moment, and I'm like, I don't know if I thought about how what I was doing was particularly radical and that it would make white people that upset, right? But it was when I think back, I'm like, yeah, this is a pretty Black assembly. I'm like, here's a video from people who went on like a Black college tour. Like, it was just like blackity black. And so, yeah, so I think for me, it's kind of nice, I think, to like kind of look back and be like, okay, like, I didn't just become this person that I am now, like, out of nowhere. Like, I feel like the threads were there, and it was just me, shedding more, I think, of that, like, belief in a multiracial exceptionalism. And then also go ahead.
I was going to say, speaking of that, because one of the pieces that you wrote about Harry and Meghan, right?
Yeah.
And what is their last name? Harry and Meghan. royalty.
Yeah,
The royals.
They have, I guess, formally left behind his and her Royal Highness monikers.
Right.
But I believe I think they still hold their title as Duchess and
Duke. Well, you wrote an exceptional piece about the saviorism complex, basically, like this interracial relationship, and even Meghan Markle herself being a multiracial person.
Mm-hmm.
Your article I was like, this is amazing. It was profound for me, but maybe you can talk a little bit about how the saviorism piece plays into how America, or even the world at this point, sees interracial couples, multiracial children. How do you see that? What have you seen?
I mean, it's very much a Western thing. This idea that, and particularly Western nations that are kind of obsessive about multiculturalism.
Mm-hmm.
So the UK, Canada, the US. So this kind of narrative that, some of this we can trace to social science. So social science has certainly spent a couple of decades basically making the case that evidence of the closing of social gaps between particularly white and Black people is signified or can be measured through increases in interracial relationships between Black and white people. So if you have more interracial relationships between Black and white people, more marriages between Black and white people, then that is supposed to signal a closing of social distance, as we call it. However, then you start looking into qualitative research, and it literally shows that, yes, white people may, be interested in having or do have, right, romantic and sexual relationships with people of a different race from them or a different ethnicity from them. And I make a point of that because I think the most common interracial or interethnic pairings that the census measures are white Hispanic couples. So just because people, are willing to engage in some form of intimacy with someone of a different race or ethnicity from them, doesn't mean that suddenly all of the racism that they've been socialized, the racism soup that they've been socialized in suddenly, goes out of effect. So again, my mother has children who, for the most part, are read as Black. Sometimes we're read as, like, I think Afro-Latinx. So my brother gets Dominican. I've gotten Dominican, Puerto Rican. I also get, Indigenous quite a bit, particularly Pacific Islanders. So Hawaiian, Samoan. So, but for the most, pretty consistently, at least in person, we are not mistaken for white people. We're pretty consistently assumed to be people of color. So, my mom had to raise 4 little brown people, and she was in an intimate relationship, with my father, and hasn't been in a relationship since. And so it's, again, she obviously has that intimacy with people of color, and she certainly likes to bring that up. However, I think about how she still says things that are problematic. And even when I have resisted other people trying to exoticize me, either as a Black woman or as a multiracial woman. So, kind of I remember there was a person who I'd matched with on one of the apps, and he'd made some comments via text about, because it was so cool that I was multiracial, and that between the two of us, our kids would be like every race.
Oh.
I was just like, I'm just like vomit emoji, like just disgusted. And my mom was like, he kept saying that I was exotic. And that's always like a cue for me. I'm like, oh, we need to, I'm washing my hands. Like, this is over. We're not talking anymore. And my mom is like, well, you are exotic. And I'm like, no. I was like, I am not an imported fruit. I am not exotic. Like, what do you mean? And even my sister, who's the next youngest down from me, similar kind of, she was like, wait, you are exotic. And they like, I remember like we were having a conversation and they both like kind of tag teamed me into being like, you're just trying to sociologicalize everything and you're just overthinking it. Blah, 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 blah. You know, so again, just because people have intimacy with people of a different race from them doesn't mean necessarily that they have progressive politics, or that they can't, you know, still subscribe to some really problematic ideas about not only like mixed race people, but in general. Like anytime I've gone out with a couple of people who were Middle Eastern or South Asian, and my mom always has something to say about like Muslim religion and like how they treat women and their values. And I'm just like, you do realize this is racist, right? Like you can't say these things about people and then try to say it's a women's rights thing. Like, you know, no. And, you know, and the number of things I've heard, you know, my white family members say, we're not even going to get into that. So yeah, you know, so there's lots and lots of evidence in the social science research, you know, that kind of shows that just because white people have people of other races in their families or they are in a relationship with them doesn't mean that they can't still be racist, even to their partners. I mean, you know, and there's like this weird line to tread between like race, you know, race play, you know, as part of, you know, a sexual dynamic that two people are consenting to, and like race influencing how you even think about like your sexual relationship with your partner. You know, but like we have to contend with, you know, the ways that for a lot of white people, like they may think it's a compliment that, you know, they're, you know, talking about the particular, especially if it's a heterosexual pairing, which a lot of the research is on heterosexual interracial relationships. We have way less research about queer interracial relationships. And even that is more so looking at gay men and talking a lot about sexual racism, right? But, you know, I mean, there's definitely, you know, the fetishizing that happens. And I think that that's something, you know, and it's weird that the US in particular puts sexuality in so much of our broader discourse and our culture, but then also has quite a bit of squeamishness about talking about sexuality and pleasure and those kinds of things, you know, which is, and to some extent, you know, that certainly makes its way into academia. So we definitely have these conversations among sexuality scholars, which I consider myself part of that subfield, you know, where like it's okay to study sexual identity and maybe to an extent the behavior, if mostly you're like, well, you know, HIV transmission or, you know, like certain kinds of ways of talking about sexual behavior. But a lot of like the actual pleasure and enjoyment that people get out of having sex doesn't really make its way into the research, because that makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah, I thought about that.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that's, I think, the thing that's kind of like interesting about the obsession with interracial relationships and mixed children and mixed people, right, is because it is to some extent an obsession, right, with sex across racial lines, and particularly sex, right, that produces, right, you know, right, that has fertility, right? And so like this idea that by virtue of having a parents who identify as different racial groups, you just are naturally imbued with the ability to bridge groups. I'm like, no, like, I mean, even if we're talking about, you know, bridging different groups, like that's actually a skill someone would have to learn. And so then perhaps if, you know, you are dealing with a family where, you know, one, it hasn't, you know, the family hasn't dissolved, there isn't, you know, certain kinds of tensions from other side, you know, each side, then maybe perhaps you learn certain kinds of skill sets about, you know, but like, then again, like, how much is that? Like, I feel like any family has to like learn how to bridge family differences,
Yeah.
right? So like, is it something that you're specific, like some skill set that you're like specifically learning to build in an interracial couple, or as a multiracial child? And you know, this has been a long-standing trope. Sci-fi, I mean, loves it. You know, I mean, and you always get these allegories for multiracial figures, particularly multiracial saviors. So you get Neo, you know, in the Matrix, right, who, you know, somehow bridges, right, humanity and the machine. You get various, you know, space you know, operas, you know, where there's some half cyborg or half human or half alien or half, you know, what, and right there, that figure is always like tragic in some way. That figure is always like, you know, kind of trying to fight for belonging, doesn't know where they fit in, right? You know, like this is a repeated narrative that you know, we kind of have an obsession with, even before at least in the US, you get kind of this uptick in basically, I think, attention to multiracial identity as an identity. So there's certainly been, you know, kind of this discussion about mixed, like, it's not like mixed race people suddenly popped up in the 1990s,
Right.
right? Or even, you know, the so-called loving generation, right? You know, of people who were born, you know, of those marriages that, you know, were made universally legal with the loving decision in 67. What you know, so we can go back, you know, to kind of the earliest days of this country, right? You know, and think about kind of how they thought about hybridity. But you know, this automatic kind of attaching it to like a better future, this ideal, the idea that, you know, even if we're like, I think particularly thinking about like multiracial Black people. So, you know, there was this period of time where, you know, there was the whole kind of, you know, hybrid degeneration kind of logic. So this idea that if you mix the races, you're actually bringing together the, like, what's going to appear are the worst features of both of those racial groups, right? And if you're, you know, this is coming at a time period when Black people were pretty universally viewed as subhuman. So, right. So also not just like whatever the like worst features of white people are going to manifest, but also like it's going to be dominated by all of the bad features, right, of Black people. So, you know, you're creating a subhuman person if you mix the races. So don't do that, right? But then, you know, you also get some arguments, the whole hybrid vigor argument, where it's like, oh, mixing the races is actually going to bring out the best in both. Which again, most of like what was considered the best qualities of Black people during these time periods of, you know, slavery and, you know, the like kind of immediately after emancipation, you know, it was about physicality. It wasn't about intellect, right? The idea was that whiteness brought intellect. And so actually you would create a problem because you would create Black people that were too smart if you had white people mixing with them. So right, so you kind of had those competing ideas. But right, I think to some extent that hybrid vigor idea has stuck around. And so there is, yeah, this idea that mixed race people are more beautiful. This idea that they're more attractive, this idea that they, you know, are going to develop some ability that, you know, people who are of one race, right, monoracial, as we call it. You have my quote fingers here, my sarcasm fingers. Like that, those ideas have still stuck around. And so I think that can, based on what I've done, talking to a number of like college age multiracials and like just other multiracial adults, people who kind of grew up with that narrative struggle with it quite a bit. And or are annoyed by it or frustrated by it. But you also have people who buy into it and who genuinely believe, you know, that they, you know, are inherently going to offer something. So it's, you know, I definitely don't want to suggest that like everybody, you know, kind of blanket hates these things. But there's a reason, I think, that like researchers at least, and I think a lot of multiracials who are academics, or other kinds of activists, kind of take issue. It's complicated, and I think kind of to go back to the earlier question you had about kind of how do you raise kids with all of this mess. I mean, I generally am a proponent of not pushing I think I struggle with you're equally both, and if you don't recognize that you're both, then you're rejecting a parent. Like I think that's not fair. And I think particularly, I think white parents need to, I think, contend with, if they have a child who is not going to be assumed to be white in their interactions with others, that they cannot get in their feelings about how that child, or when they become an adult, just decides to identify and decides to move through the world. I mean, I fight with my mother a lot about the fact that I'm like, it's not that I don't tell people that my mother is white. I constantly tell people my mother's white. I show pictures of her. I have pictures of her. Everybody knows my mom's white. If you know me, you know my mom is white. I'm like, I literally wrote a whole article that's called "Your Mama is Day-Glow White" to talk about my white mama. So I'm like, nobody can be under, the assumption that like I'm just like pretending I don't have a white mom. I'm like, but like for me, I move through the world as, yes, a light-skinned but Black woman.
Yeah.